Hi, Dr. Moore. I hope you're doing well. This is my submission for the third and final reading reflection. The first prompt that was given to us asks to define and discuss how discursive positioning, whiteness, racial and ability profiling, implicit bias, gender, and sexual orientations have led to the exclusion of students with disabilities from accessing effective education. There is a lot in this prompt, many of which we have discussed over the last few months, as well as in the last reading reflection. However, for right now, I really want to hone in on this idea of whiteness and show how I believe that whiteness is at the core, at the root of these other issues that we have discussed and learned about in class. So what is whiteness? Whiteness is a concept that in a racialized society, which we live in, whiteness is positioned as normative, as the dominant. Then everyone else is ranked and categorized in relation to whiteness. We live in a society where white, the skin tone, the white skin tone, the lack of melanin is positioned as dominant, as normative. That is the idea of whiteness. So then when we take that idea, now we have that idea of whiteness and connect it back to Davies and Hare's positioning theory. Again, for reference, Davies and Hare describe positioning theory as the process through which people are placed into different identities, whether that be roles, categories, storylines, through culturally and historically situated interactions, and the ways in which they respond by taking up that identity or by attempting to reposition themselves. Right. And then as I took this slide from my previous reading reflection, Collins then adds that this at excuse me, then he adds that positioning theory offers us a lens through which to view social identity formation. However, I think an asterisk, something that I would add to Collins's description of positioning theory is that we must note that this social identity formation, this social identity forms with the understanding that an individual is existing within a racialized society where whiteness is normative or where whiteness is dominant. And that is incredibly crucial to understanding positioning theory. You're not just positioning randomly, right? We're not putting these labels on people randomly. They are in relation to the dominant narrative, which in the case of the United States is whiteness. So I do want to circle back. Let's look at an example I looked at this last time as well, of Kenita, the Black second grader in, I believe, the Herring Killinger text, who was placed in an EBD program based on the school personnel's assessment that positioned her family as dysfunctional, given the number of people living in the home as a multi-generational household, and that the mother was incarcerated. Right? The school personnel is white. We're operating under that assumption. And given this implicit bias, this limiting belief that the school personnel is placing upon Kenita and her family, her educational progress was completely overshadowed by her untraditional home life. Right? The limiting beliefs of the school personnel ultimately hindered Kenita's future educational progress. Right? As we looked at last time, they're putting this label. They are the school personnel is operating under this bias of dysfunctional. The mother is incarcerated. She must have this EBD placement. Wow, this is all true. The school personnel is operating under these limiting beliefs, under these harmful biases. But if we dig a little deeper, they are also operating under this idea of whiteness being the norm. Kenita is unfairly positioned, but it is perpetuated by the fact of whiteness is the norm. A nuclear family is the norm. And since Kenita is not that, she is categorized based on that relation to whiteness. So again, to break that down, Kenita lives in a society where whiteness is normative and dominant. The white members of the school personnel have the limiting belief or the implicit bias that since Kenita lives in a multi-generational home without her mother, her family is dysfunctional. And then Kenita, since they have that label as dysfunctional, it is clear the school personnel that Kenita must be placed in an EBD program, right? They are positioning her that way while comparing her to her white counterparts. And as we know, Kenita is not the only student, not the only family that experiences this kind of oppression and this kind of systematic harm. So the next part of this prompt is, how do we change this? How do we use the pedagogical philosophies, theoretical frameworks, and practices we've learned about to dismantle these implicit bias, these harmful systems that we operate under? I'm going to highlight a few. First, disability critical race theory, coined by Dr. Inama. Talked a lot about in this course, highlighting from Dr. Inama's text. Discrit highlights the need for intersectional approaches to the study of race and disability, and then Discrit encourages scholars to employ a variety of perspectives and theories in theoretical and empirical work. Again, I pulled another quote. Discrit also aims to create knowledge-rooted intersectional commitments. What I think is beautiful about disability critical race theory is that commitment to intersectionality. Obviously, in a K through 12 setting, you might not necessarily be diving into some heavy research and using critical race theory as a lens. However, there is ways to amplify intersectional identities, whether that be disability, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., into the classroom, in which I'll get to with the next prompt. I don't think we talked much about this in this class, but in previous courses, we've talked ample about feminist teaching pedagogy. Feminist teaching pedagogy is a theory about teaching or learning process that guides our choice of classroom practices. I found this really wonderful graphic from Feminist Teach on Twitter that asks, are you practicing feminist teaching pedagogy? Are you aware of racial and gender bias in your classroom? Do you work to dismantle bias in your classroom? Do you practice active learning with your students? Do you create equal opportunities for your students learning in the classroom? I think taking a deep dive into feminist teaching pedagogy can be a great way for teachers and school communities to begin to have that conversation of what it can look like to dismantle these harmful systems in the classroom, to teach students about maybe their own implicit bias, to teach teachers about their own implicit bias in a K through 12 setting. And again, what I was thinking about just a moment ago, what are some suggestions that you have for future educators to promote an all-inclusive classroom? What I will note is on this prompt, we are thinking this is the most perfect world. I know an all-inclusive classroom, that is the dream, and I hope that we can get there. But I do want to acknowledge that baby steps are good too. It's not going to be a flip of a switch to a non-inclusive to an all-inclusive classroom. I've included a few things. The books we read are incredibly important. Whether that be children's books for children or something that's more appropriate for a high school age, college age person. So I included this particular short story by Toni Morrison called Recitative. Dr. Moore, I don't know if you've read it. You probably have, but this particular short story changed, dare I say, my life. I read this in high school. It is probably the best piece of literature I have read. Definitely top 5. Um, Introducing race and ability, diversity in gender and sexual orientation into the classroom through books and the types of things that we read and watch is just one step in the right direction when it comes to dismantling implicit biases. As well as the bottom, I have a little graphic of some teachers. In a perfect world, we would see teacher populations be representative of the population, right? We wouldn't see a bunch of white women in front of the classroom. Maybe some white women, but also black women and black men, Latinx women and men teaching as well. I think that they bring such a unique and important perspective, and their physical being in the classroom for students to see their teacher look like someone like them is priceless and incredibly important to dismantle these systems. And again, I know that I've pulled a few things from the last reading response, but I do think it is still applicable. I shared these learner profile worksheets as well as keeping in mind of the social identity web, and checking in with some emotional intelligent exercises with students. Um, all of these things can just do wonders for educators to promote an inclusive classroom. Here are my references. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore.